screen. Let's see. Okay. Um, so this presentation is a version of something that actually I put together, highlighting some of the findings from our 10-year impact report. So as I mentioned, University of BC was founded in 2016 in the UK. And also, as Miriam mentioned, until April of this year, through May of this year, I was CEO of Diversity BC. I am now a board member in the US. She already gave me an intro. Many of you know me, so I will, stick to that. Um, but Diversity BC's mission, we're a nonprofit globally, on a mission to make venture capital entrepreneurship more inclusive and reflective of the society we live in, because we believe that this is the key to, building better business. Inclusion is about also building dynamic and resilient teams that spark bold ideas and boost returns. Um, and it is, I think, like I can say on this call, a lot of the motivation behind this is yes, like this is the right thing to do. When I talk to VCs, I also naturally have to emphasize that it's not only the right thing to do, but also it is like this is just good business. And so I think also please feel free as I'm talking if there's things that I reference regarding venture capital that you're not sure what that means or you want to push back because, like please feel free. The best kind of presentation is actually more of a conversation. Um, so over the last 10 years, these are just a few of the many collaborators that we've worked with around the world, spanning from some of the largest venture capital funds in the world to also, the NASDAQ Entrepreneurial Center in San Francisco, other nonprofits in the space, Black VC, Always, Together International, Start Out, Vets in Tech in the US. And, we wouldn't have been able to do the work that we've done without these individuals and organizations. Um, so 2016 to 2026, what's changed, what hasn't, and like what's worked, what have we learned? Um, so basically, as I mentioned, we started 10 years ago. To be clear, was not part of this 10 years ago. I was still living in San Francisco, working at another nonprofit at the time. But when Diversity VC set out 10 years ago, it was to change not only, basically who's funding, but also who's building those companies, because we know it's so important to who gets funded is who's actually sitting on the other side of the table writing that check. And the assumption that we made was that if we could measure the problem clearly enough, the system would change. And I think, talking to all of you around evaluation, this is something we all think about a lot, right? Is like what gets measured gets managed, right? And so for the first time, and this was around the same time that the National Venture Capital Association in the US did their first report on the human capital survey with Deloitte, uh, looking at gender and race. In the UK, there had been nothing of the kind, and so the Diversity VC partnered with the British VC Association to release their first report. And for the first time, we knew that while women made up nearly half of the UK labor force, they were only a little over a quarter of those working in venture capital, right? And so we also know that, of course, like women graduate at higher rates than men. So like we are 50% of the population, but we weren't seeing that in this field. And that in particular, their participation was highly concentrated in non-investment roles. And even worse, about two-thirds of funds had no women in decision-making roles. And about half of them had no women on their investment teams whatsoever. The reason why this matters, and like we do see that women in general tend to be much more concentrated in marketing positions and platform positions and like the research or the increase in ESG rules, for example, on funds, a lot of those are also um, held by women, and that's great. But the problem is that if you don't have women on the investment teams, then which are actually the teams that are making the decision of who they're going to be putting money into, right? Then like it doesn't really matter how many women you have on the rest of the team if they're not there able to influence those decisions, and in particular at senior levels. Um, so, and over time, we started, that was the first report was only looking at gender. But over time, we started to see the same pattern repeating itself across every dimension we looked at, not just gender, but ethnicity, socioeconomic background, education. And the specifics changed, but quite frankly, the underlying pattern didn't, right? And so again, and this is where Now, this is data taken from across all of the VC funds that we have worked with over the 10 years. So that does include both US, UK, EU, and Latin America. Um, I do think it's important to say that we have seen progress. And in particular, what we saw in the UK is that the percentage of firms with no women on the investment team has dropped significantly over the past decade, as well as that actually other organizations are now measuring this, right? So it's not just us saying like, hey, we need to look at this, but now the government themselves have initiatives such as the Investing in Women Code in the UK that are measuring this. In the US, we have Alraise that are looking at this. And so, it's not just us beating the drum. There's many others that are now out there doing this work. And that matters because it reflects a real shift in awareness and hiring and in how firms are thinking about their teams. But when we look at where the money is actually going, the story is very different. And in fact, research from a nonprofit that the Diversity VC acquired last year, Extend Ventures, showed that just how concentrated those outcomes still are. And quite frankly, again, this is very similar to the numbers in the US. This is UK data, but it's very similar to the numbers in the US in terms of, like less than a quarter of a percentage point of capital raised going to Black founders, less than 0.02% capital raised going to Black women founders. Similar statistics in the US for Latina founders. And so while access has improved in some ways, the outcomes haven't shifted at the same pace, which makes sense because if we think about again like decision making power, who has that, where we see um, folks diversifying in terms of their team composition, it's usually entry level first, right? You have to build a workforce up. And so, of course, where we're still lacking diversity at the decision making level, we are still going to see this lagging behind in terms of where the money is going, as well as and this is, I don't necessarily have data on this, but I think we can all think about this from a psychological perspective of when you have worked, I don't know if you all remember that when Hillary ran for president, there was all this, like, why is she wearing so many pantsuits? And it's like, because she came up in a world where she had to emulate men to be able to get ahead, right? And so like we see that also in many fields and in venture capital as well, of like venture capital is an industry of pattern matching. And those patterns have quite frankly already been sort of determined by those that came before us. And so even when you're breaking into this field and coming from a different background and a different mindset, it can sometimes be challenging you have to play the game to get in, but then how do you sort of like bring your own unique perspective into that to sort of expand the universe of ideas and of opportunity. Um, and so we also then, I think, and we were the organization to do this for the first time in both the US and the UK, just to look deeper at socioeconomic background and education as well, and not just look at gender and ethnicity. But of course, like venture capital remains heavily concentrated among people from a very narrow set of institutions and backgrounds. And in fact, um, you know, Harlem Capital did a great report in the U.S. looking at how like 50% of those in partner positions in the U.S. went to either like Harvard Business School, Stanford Business School, or Wharton, right? And so like when that is the case, um, it's they're trained in a certain way. There's just a certain mindset, and so it becomes very hard to break through when you don't come from one of those networks. Which essentially means that the system is shaped long before any individual investment decision is made. Also, if you have a keen eye, you may have just noticed one of my cats jumped behind me. Uh, I have three rescue cats from Peru, so sometimes they like to join me on calls. Um, and when you look at the founders that are raising capital, you see almost the exact same pattern, right? So founders from elite or well-connected backgrounds capture a disproportionate share of funding, which is the same idea as I was saying before of like, we know that people invest in people like themselves. And so, and in fact, essentially, this is just how decision making works. There's research back from 2018 that, quite frankly, is still some of the best research we have out there by Gompers and Copat, showing that we investors are 39% more likely to invest in founders from the same ethnic background as themselves, and 34% more likely to invest in founders from the same school. So again, if we have the concentration of people making those investment decisions from certain schools, then naturally we're also going to see the same in terms of who they're investing in. Um, which is also the moment when we had to sort of realize that, I think I mentioned at the beginning, we came at this from the assumption that if we could measure the problem, then things would change. But, and I'm sure, again, I'm sure I'm preaching to the choir, measurement alone does not change outcomes, right? It's essential. We can't change what we're not measuring, but the data on its own is not going to shift behavior. It doesn't change how decisions get made. We deliberately shifted away from diagnosing the problem. We still do that. We still, do reports on a sort of biannual basis. But we decided we needed to do more to try to change it. So we focused on two parts of the system where we believed we could have the most impact: access and decision making. On the access side, we launched Future VC in 2019. The goal was pretty simple: expand who gets the first opportunity to enter the industry. It was an internship program designed to help get more people from diverse backgrounds into venture capital, give them the skills that they needed, and place them in funds to also get the mentorship and real world experience that they needed to be able to then get jobs. Because if the pipeline stays narrow, then of course the outcomes will too. So we focused on those, like creating those entry points. Um, and over the 5, 6 years that we ran the program, we had more than 600 participants. We placed more than 100 interns, and 97% of those interns were secured full-time roles in venture capital after their internships. But we realized that there were, particularly in the US, actually, there had become quite a few opportunities and programs for those trying to break into venture, but that they were reaching a certain point and then leaving. And so we decided to sort of refocus into how could we get them to, if they wanted to stay in venture capital, how did we help them to stay in venture capital? So we launched end of 2024 something called the Career Development Program to accelerate mid-career VCs along their path to partner, to either help them to become partners in the funds that they were already in or in other firms, or to launch their own funds. But the question also became like, what is actually driving those outcomes? And so as I mentioned, we developed something called the Diversity VC Standard. The standard was actually a certification process for funds to go through, an analysis of all of their processes and policies, everything from, what kinds of family leave policies do they have? Do they have a code of conduct? What's in it? Through to how they structure their hiring processes, retention, promotion, as well as of course their investment processes. But quite frankly, actually a lot of it focuses on the internal operations of the fund, because you have to get your own house in order first to be able to then sort of either proselytize to their portfolio companies, which is what funds most often ask us about, or to also sort of live when you're, and this is again, I think we'll get to this in terms of what data and why and when, but like you need to understand internally first what your priorities are in terms of access and what diversity means to you and how you're going to promote that internally in your fund before you can then go and say like, this is the data we want to collect from founders, for example. So what we've observed is that when funds go through the standard, we do see meaningful differences in their team composition over time. I do want to be clear that this is not a controlled experiment. Obviously, funds are also, except for 5 funds that were told by their LP in Latin America to go through the standard, all of the other more than 100 funds that went through the standard self-selected to go through the standard with us. Also, I think it's important to note that the standard was launched in fall of 2020. So there was a certain moment going on in the US and globally at that time, right, that made this a bit more just interesting to funds. And that was the zeitgeist that they were trying to conform to, quite frankly, in some cases. But I do think that what it shows is that when you introduce structure, when you make decision making more intentional, more accountable, you do start to see different outcomes. So here you can see that funds that went through the diversity VC standard increased the gender diversity on their teams by 10%. And they reduced the concentration of women within non-investment roles, right? Which I spoke about at the beginning. And we saw similar patterns beyond gender. Funds that engaged with this kind of structured approach also showed broader shifts, including increased ethnic representation and more balanced distribution of roles across teams. So we saw a 2x increase in Black representation at senior levels in funds that went through the standard from before to after. But again, I do want to stress, especially in the context of this group, that this is not necessarily proving causation, but it does reinforce the idea that when you change how decisions are made, you can create the conditions for different outcomes. Um, and this is, uh, I probably should have had this slide a little bit earlier. This is explaining a little bit more about how the standard works. But basically, the idea is to help them level up and mitigate bias. And these are the five different levels that funds can go through, starting from foundation, which is really about like making sure that they are abiding by all equal opportunity laws in the US, going through to emerging, established, advanced, and leading, which are the funds that are actually like defining what good, like amazing looks like in the industry. We have not had any funds get certified at level five yet. We have had a couple funds at level three and one fund at level four. Um, we've certified more than 100 funds globally that represent more than $44 billion in AUM. I think another thing that as we're looking at this, that I just want to sort of put out there that I know we'll talk about a little bit later in my conversation with Miriam is that we actually, as much as like the measurement of who's getting funded or who you're hiring, et cetera, the data collection piece is really important. We don't usually request or suggest that funds start doing that until they're preparing for level three. And part of that is, again, because we think it's really important that they have done the internal work to understand why they want to collect the data that they do want to collect, and ensure that they also have the correct processes in place to be able to collect that data safely and securely for individuals. Um, so I think like quite honestly, the real lesson that we learned over the last 10 years, or the biggest lesson we learned, is that what drives change isn't intent or even belief, it's the systems around decision making. It's who's in the room, how opportunities are sourced, and what gets rewarded. Those are the things that ultimately shape outcomes. And what's changed over the past decade is that this work is no longer happening at the margins, and that's great. Hopefully, all of you have heard about some of the organizations that are on this map, and that I mentioned earlier. I'll say them again: Black VC, All Raise, Start Out, Bets in Tech, Together International, and there's so many more that are doing really important work, VC include. Um, and so we're seeing this broader ecosystem work of limited partners, industry bodies, such as the fact that even the National VC Association in the US does, conduct their human capital survey with Deloitte, all working to shift different parts of the system, which is what actually creates the momentum, right? And begins to shift the system itself and not just the conversation around it. And even the fact that we're having this conversation, and like I'll be honest, part of the reason why the 10-year impact report was oriented more towards the UK was also because at the moment when we were publishing it, it was like, ooh, do we really? And again, I know this is something Mary and I will talk about a little bit later, but is this the time to be having this? Like, yes, it's still the time to be having this conversation in the US. And it's a tough time to be having the conversation in the US. And so to insulate ourselves a little bit from the political backlash in the US, we made the decision to focus a little bit more on the UK, even make sure that all of the small things like when we spell, spell check, our spell check is on UK English, right? So that we can be like, yeah, this is UK focused, UK, whatever, even though we do still do work in the US. So it's just little things like that that we did, knowing that we didn't want to change our name, but to sort of like help insulate a little bit from the moment. So we started by believing that if we could measure the problem, the system would change. But what we've learned is that systems only change when we redesign them. And that raises the question of like, what do we do with that, right? Looking back on the last decade, looking forward to the next decade, we really believe that the focus isn't necessarily going to be on collecting more data, though it's important to continue doing so. It's about making these kind of changes the default, not the exception, embedding them into how firms operate, how capital is allocated, and how success is defined, because ultimately, this isn't just about inclusion, it's about whether venture capital can operate as a system that consistently finds and backs the best opportunities. And why that matters is because if you look at the stock market on any given day, the 10, like any, if you, and the 10 largest companies by market cap, usually anywhere from 5 to 9 of those are, they were venture capital backed, right? So like Amazon, Microsoft, Facebook, Google, Nvidia, like all of these companies were VC backed. They all happen to have like straight white male founders. And imagine if they had been women, women of color, people with disabilities, like gay women. Like, just imagine the different world we would be living in. I think it would be different, at least, because we do live in a capitalist system, and so that is like the reality that we're working within. And so, that's really why it matters so much who is getting funded, and therefore, of course, like who's making those funding decisions. Um, so these are sort of like three things that we believe need to change if we want to make these changes the default, so that venture capital can actually operate as a system that consistently finds and backs the best opportunities, which we think of as being diverse. So first, we need to really believe and apply that idea that like diversification, which is something that the industry is already very comfortable thinking about when it comes to in simple investment terms, right? Sector, stage, geography. But that same logic needs to apply to who gets hired, who gets funded, and who makes decisions, right? So diversification needs to apply to people, not just portfolios. Second, structure has to become standard. So the things that reduce bias, like we cannot rely on individual intent. They need to be built into how firms operate, which the number of times that a venture capitalist will say something to me along the lines of that famous, like, I know it when I see it type of thing, or like, well, this is my special sauce. I'm allergic to structure. I'm like, okay, you're not the right person for me to have this conversation with because we as human beings are naturally biased. And so we have to build in the systems to help us to mitigate that bias. That's just who we are. And then third, we have to move from measurement to action. Data still matters, but only insofar as it leads to different decisions. It's not just about what data you're collecting, but how you're using it. For example, to understand where founders from underrepresented groups are dropping out of your pipeline, or to implement family leave policies across the whole team that include provisions to continue pension contributions while people are out on leave, which is one of the most common thing that drops for women when they're on maternity leave, for example. Um, so those are just a few examples of major changes that we think could make a real difference in the industry. Um, but yeah, I know like this is if you'd like to download our 10-year impact report, you can scan this QR code and we'll also drop the link in the chat. But now I think it's time if any questions, and also I know Miriam and I have a little bit of a fireside chat planned. So I will.
Thank you, Megan. Anyone have
Yeah.
any questions before we get into the fireside chat? All right. I'll let those come up then as we do the fireside chat. But yeah, Megan, again, thank you. That was a really insightful presentation. I was taking as many notes as I could. So many good nuggets in there. And I'm excited to discuss with you further some of these questions. The first one is venture capital represents only a tiny fraction of global investments each year. Why does it matter so much, particularly when there are so many other urgent social and economic challenges competing for our attention?
Yeah. I think first of all, I'll say that, and I've had to think about this a lot over the last couple of years because um actually being totally transparent with this group of people, and I do know that this is being recorded, but a large part of my decision to step down as CEO was funding related. We just could no longer afford to have a full-time exec. Um, and that was a really hard decision, but I also, as an American, and looking at just like the time and moment that we're living through, I totally agree with the funding priorities that these foundations have right now, right? Like that is where we should be putting our money. At the same time, I will say, I do think it is at our peril that we ignore the venture capital industry, precisely for what I mentioned sort of towards the end of my presentation, which is that like the decisions that these VCs are making are, first of all, like private capital is so opaque. It is behind closed doors. All of the decisions are being made behind closed doors. VCs are particularly the largest funds are practically unaccountable to anyone because they are such hot ticket items that as soon if one pension fund decides that actually like something doesn't sit quite right with them and they're, I don't know, like let's say it's a union pension fund, and they decide, actually we're going to take our money out of A16Z because we don't agree with some of the decisions that they're making. Quite frankly, the list of people and like that will just sort of immediately flow in to close whatever gap is created by that pension leaving is so long, that it is really genuinely challenging to put any pressure on funds like that of that size. Um, and yet we have to try because they are making decisions that impact our future. I mean, I still remember sitting in my computer class and like being told about Google and making my first Google search. Like whatever this generation's future of that or version of that is, probably something to do with AI. Like this is determining our future. And actually, AI is a great example. There's a wonderful nonprofit called Majority Action that are doing some incredible work organizing around AI and data centers from an investment perspective that I highly recommend you look into. And they did a fantastic report a few months ago that I'll send you the link to, Miriam, so you can share it with folks afterwards. But basically, they were looking at how these data centers are being funded so I mentioned union pension funds. In the US, the largest limited partners, so the largest investors in venture capital funds are pension funds, and foundations, and university endowments. So we have in the US a lot of union pension funds like CalPERS, in uh, California. I mean, my mom was part of the Pennsylvania Teachers Union, so PCERS, her pension is invested in VC funds.
Uh-huh.
Um, and these pensions who represent like in theory, they're representing their union members, right? They're funding VC funds who are then funding these AI companies that are then building these data centers that are literally like undermining the quality of life, health, of like individuals who could be their pension members. And then also fund like creating, or being used to process the data behind, like specifically they looked into Grok AI, right? So like an AI that is also explicitly racist, misogynist, and just doing horrible things. And then also that AI is being used in many cases, in terms of factory workers in the US to like analyze their working patterns to potentially like undermine their union cases, right? Like it is this horribly vicious circle. And that is also why like and venture is this like very early on leverage point that can be like pushed on. Um, but again, like and I acknowledge it's hard. Like it's hard. It's not easy. But it's even worse if we don't know that it's there. And like I was 25 before I even knew what the word startup or venture capital was when I moved to San Francisco. Like that was when I first learned what this was. And I think that's also why, like, despite my background being in human rights and all, like I immediately got drawn to this field because it was like, wait a second, this thing that I'd never heard of is actually like and this small group of people is making decisions that is going to determine my future, and I should care about that.
That's such a compelling case you make. I see. Yeah, I'll go ahead. Or would you like me to read the question out? I can do that.
You're
Yeah,
welcome to
Yael, do you
read
want
it.
to open? Yeah, go
You
for
can
it.
read it.
Oh no, since you're off me. Okay. I'll read it. How should a nonprofit organization on the other side, trying to learn from VC how it works, how to approach a venture capitalist, translate these findings? For example, look for people who went to the same university, of the same ethnic background to increase their chances of investment. You can see the question too. I'm not
Yeah.
sure if I did it justice.
That's idea.
I'll just
Yeah,
add, I'm
or
assuming the first part is like cringe and that's not what you want to have happen, right? On the other hand, right, do you take these stats and at the same time challenge the venture capitalists and say, oh, you should invest in our organization? I mean, the problem is the latter. I'm guessing if you challenge and criticize, you're probably not going to get the funding. And the former is not what you want to be doing either because it's reinforcing the model. So between those problematic
Yeah.
realities, what is your insightful wisdom how to approach that or deal with it?
Yeah. I will say I do think that some of this is human nature, right? So like, and this is such a great, I literally, Gal, I swear I'm not giving this example because you're on this call, but I always say when people approach me on LinkedIn, I know if they've done their homework on me, if they like mention something about Sesame Street. And and it does increase the likelihood that I'm going to respond, right? Like if I feel like somebody has done the time, like taken the time to understand a little bit about my background, to make some sort of connection with me. Now, it does not have to be us going to the same school. And in fact, I'm probably a little bit, because of the work that I do, I'm probably a little bit more like, oh, you didn't try, you went to my same school, but you therefore, and you didn't try to like find anything about me. So maybe I'm not going to connect with you. But somebody who didn't and does do the work to try to connect with me, right? Like, and I think that's in general, that's just human nature and a good thing to do. So if you're trying, and I recommend that to everyone who's trying to connect with people in the space. I think the, I definitely did drink a little of the Kool-Aid of venture capital when I lived in San Francisco, although I feel like I spent the last like 5 years trying or 6 years trying to like undrink that Kool-Aid. Um, but I do think that most VCs or like the Bay Area ethos is that if you reach out to somebody and you make your ask specific and you find a way to connect with them and you ask them for like 15 minutes of their time and maybe offer to buy them a coffee or like, make it really easy for them to click on your calendar link or something, people are pretty willing and open to like have those conversations. Um, and as part of doing your research on those people, that's where you can sort of figure out, are they the kind of people I can challenge or not, or are they just of my same ethos or not? Um, I do think though that it's important to note VCs won't invest, and maybe I misunderstood the question, but VCs are very unlikely to invest in a nonprofit. I mean, there are tech nonprofits that sometimes will receive investment from VCs, and in that case, like Fast Forward is a great resource. Uh, in also in the Bay Area, an accelerator for tech-based nonprofits. But I would actually be looking more at some of the foundations that, through their for-profit investing, invest in funds, but who are simultaneously, uh, through their like philanthropic um, measures, investing in or supporting nonprofits that are trying to build a different reality, right? And thinking about things from an economic justice perspective. So that's more where I would look for. But again, and that's what we were doing. And I will say it's like a really hard time for that kind of fundraising because most of these foundations who care about this from an economic justice perspective are, quite frankly, just like overwhelmed by the need, particularly to do with the immigration crisis in the US and ICE and the border and all of this. And like I said, like I'm glad that they're funding those things because we need it. So yeah.
Gosh.
Did that answer your question? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, it is really stunning how you can have these entities that are doing good work or supporting teachers, et cetera. But then the way that they're establishing their pensions and growing the pension fund is through things that are diametrically opposed to, or at least undercutting the work of the people who the pension fund is supporting. So I
Yeah.
can definitely see how important it is to not let venture capital go by the wayside in light of other priorities.
Yeah. And I will say actually on that, there are examples. So NYCERS, the New York City Employee Retirement System, did manage and this is a listed security example, but I think it's one that we could use to try to like see a vision for what we could do within venture capital is that they made the decision to divest from fossil fuels. They were taken to court by three pensioners, really by like a right wing org using these three pensioners, who said like you're putting at risk our pension, and they won their case, arguing that actually their responsibility is not only to their past and present pensioners, but also to their future pensioners. And that if they're investing in fossil fuels that are creating a world where it's going to be so hot, like global warming is it's going to be so hot that like they have to have their air conditioning on all the time, which makes everything, energy is more expensive. There's no fruits and vegetables at the, corner store. Like that actually that world that they're creating by investing in fossil fuels is a negative environment for their pensioners. And so therefore, by divesting of that, like they're trying to create a better environment where their pensioners will have a better future and also be able to like live on their pension as opposed to not. And they won that case in court. So there are examples of pensions that have, taken that kind of stance from listed securities perspective, right? And so now it's just a question of like, can we replicate that in private equities?
I see. And the social, just connecting this back to the social finance part, because I know plenty of
Yeah.
people, at least who might be watching this video, or learning more about that space or the recording. And the social finance element is that they're looking at when they're talking about, we're not just talking about our current pensioners, but like the future and the world that they'll live in. That's the
Yes.
social return. That's not the
Yeah.
financial return.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm still continuing to learn about social finance and learning also about venture capital and just understanding this. And you're doing such a tremendous job, at least for me, like clarifying how this works and why it matters, etc. I see a question. Oh no, Tina was just saying she had to jump off. Okay. Um, Another question. We've got about 15 minutes left. One of the key themes in your talk is that measurement alone doesn't change systems. Many organizations are eager to start collecting diversity data, but what do you think needs to happen before organizations even begin measuring?
Yeah. So I think this is the most important thing because as I sort of alluded to earlier, a lot of funds would come to us and be like, how can we make this better for our, or like, what do we need to tell our portfolio companies to do? Or like, we know we have a problem. And so like, what do we do? And as much as I applaud the fact that they're like, it's great that you know you have a problem or you think you have a problem and you want to change it. They're often thinking about it first externally, and I really encourage any organization to think first internally about like who you are as an organization. A lot of organizations, not a lot of VCs, but a lot of other like nonprofits, whatever, like you'll have a theory of change, right? So like, what's that problem you're trying to solve? Which decisions are you trying to improve? And how does that relate not only to like the external what you're doing, but also internally how you're operating yourselves? Um, I always say, like, you got to get your own house in order before you tell anybody else to do that. Not just because it's the right thing to do, but also because, like, cognitive dissonance. It's really hard to get somebody to listen to, particularly, one example that we get a lot is around hiring. And it's true, venture capital funds are small. They're very infrequently hiring. They will almost only hire when either somebody leaves or they raise a new fund. But hiring is an area where they're constantly being asked by their portfolio companies to advise on, right? And it's really important because um, the portfolio companies are growing very rapidly, and who they hire at an early stage is going to probably determine their culture. And actually, in that same Gompers article from Harvard Business Review, he talks about how like when they did a look back, or like I think I don't remember who exactly from it might have been Susan Wozniacki who they were interviewing at Google early on, talking about like if only we'd made some of these changes earlier instead of when we'd already were at like 100,000 employees. Like it just would have been so much easier to create the culture, the inclusive culture we wanted if we'd done it from day one, as opposed to like looking back and having to do it retroactively. And so I think that's where it's like really important to have, like a leadership commitment, have somebody accountable for acting on whatever findings you find in terms of like what needs to change or what problem you're trying to solve, mapping that decision-making process again, like who's responsible and accountable for that. Um, and from an internal perspective, what we care most about is like hiring, sourcing of candidates, how they're screened, promotion internally, right? Retention, to try to identify where bias and bottlenecks might exist. And the same goes, quite frankly, for the investment processes or for grant making processes, right? It's looking at like, and the place where I often recommend funds start is to just really simply start with um, asking yourselves the question, So first I'll say, once you've sort of figured out like what you're trying to solve for, right? Like then it's like, okay, well, what data is going to help me solve for that? So if, for example, we're trying to solve for, like, um, and this kind of goes for both investment decision making and hiring decision making, like we're not getting enough, let's say, like female founders in the pipeline, or like, reaching the interview process, or, and so it's like, okay, well, um, how many are you getting top of funnel, right? And whether that's like how many applicants you're getting for a job, or how many founders, how many startups, or how many organizations that are applying for funding in some way, shape, or form have women in their leadership and in their, founding team. And then looking at like where they are perhaps falling off through that funnel, right? So if maybe you actually have like 40% of the companies that get to you top of funnel that have a woman on their founding team, but only 10% of the companies that go to your investment committee have women on the founding team. Well, where are they falling off? Is it like at that first sort of information finding stage, first interview stage? Like, where is that happening, to try to identify where your biases perhaps are coming in, to then be able to design interventions, right, to try to like fix that. If, on the other hand, actually 40% of the companies that are entering your top of funnel and 40% of those that get presented to the IC do have female founders, but then only 10% of those that get through the investment committee have female founders, okay, then maybe like your screening processes are okay, but maybe you have a problem with your investment committee. Having just one woman or person of color or somebody who's not a straight white man on your investment committee is not enough. um, you need to also create like the structures in place so that the person, for example, with the most power is not the person speaking first, right? Like they should be speaking last. It's just little things like that, which quite frankly, a lot of these are like good HR practices, but because venture capital funds are often so small, it becomes challenging sometimes to implement some of these policies, just because like they're startups themselves. And so it's really just sort of trying to use the information, figure out like what's your goal, what data do you need to try to like learn more about that, and then creating a an intervention, and then seeing if that's working, right? Which may take time.
Yeah. Yeah, that certainly makes sense because I mean, the decision to be measuring anything is in theory a decision to have a process where data are collected and something is done with it. So if you just try to collect the data without planning what you're going to do with it,
Yes.
getting the buy-in for that, it's kind of like not a useful exercise.
Yeah, and I think, Miriam, what you just said about something's actually done with it is like almost the most important part, because I do see a lot of funds, especially post 2020, they started to implement these questionnaires for founders that were asking them about all of these different types of personal demographics information. And that's okay if you're going to learn from it, right? Like if you're actually going to plot that information, also keep it safe and secure, um, and actually figure out, as I was saying, like, where are they falling off in your pipeline, et cetera? Like, how can you design better processes? But if you're collecting that data and you're doing nothing with it, like once you ask somebody for that information, first of all, we know that there's a bias towards like those who have been impacted in some way, shape, or form by bias and discrimination are much more likely to actually fill out those forms, right? They get excited. There's this feeling of like, oh, they're asking me this information. I feel seen. Let me fill this out. But then you you can create a trust issue that actually backfires if you don't do anything with that information, right? It's like, well, I've shared this with you, but now you're not doing anything with it. And it's not about like, oh, I shared this with you, therefore I should get the funding. No. And also, to be clear, in the US, it is super important anywhere, but it's super important if you're asking this information and and you do have an investment or some kind of like financial decision-making process, to make clear that this information is not being used in your decision making, in your investment decision-making process. I'm not a lawyer, but that is really important to say. Um, but it is also really important that you then are like actually, evaluating that data, using it for something to be able to improve your processes to make sure that more founders can get through who coming from diverse backgrounds.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And that's a good point about the trust issue. If you're collecting data and then not doing anything with it, it's going to backfire, your enterprise, your effort at least. Uh, we have 7 minutes left. Let's see. Um, okay. third question. I think we can get another question in. Once those foundations are in place, what should organizations actually measure if they only have the capacity to track a handful of indicators?
Yeah, I think we touched on this a little bit in the last question, but I guess I'll just say I would focus primarily on like measuring bottlenecks, right? Like, you can't measure everything, that's just impossible. And so, it's like, as I was saying, who's entering the pipeline, um, from a, deal flow, who's getting meetings versus who's getting funding, hiring pipeline, who's getting to the interview versus like versus not. There's all kinds of research, again, like many years of HR research and findings that shows, for example, that if you ensure that your short list or your long interview long list has at least 50-50 men and women, and you ensure that those that are interviewing your candidates, there's at least two women on that panel, then it's 75% more likely you'll choose a woman candidate. We do not have the same research for different ethnic backgrounds and other types of diversity, but I would harbor a guess that it would be similar. And we do have some funds that we've worked with that have actually requested that of, for example, a lot of funds work with headhunters and they'll say like, hey, you need to bring us like an equitable list of people from all different ethnic backgrounds and different genders. And that's just like how we're going to do our hiring. And if you can't do that, then like bye. And that's another thing that you can do if you're in a position to influence hiring practices, either and you are working with a headhunter, like ask that of your headhunters and your recruiters. Like, this is not crazy. I had a conversation a couple of months back with a woman who is a partner in a fund that she started. So she has power and decision making, like influence in this fund. And she lamented, she was like, yeah, we've like worked with three different recruiters and none of them have brought us any like women candidates. Like, but they answer to you. You could tell that she was like, oh, we still managed to hire some great people, but all men. And I was like, I'm sure they're bringing you great candidates. That's their job. But you could tell them, like, I'm sorry, this is not acceptable. You need to bring me a list that also includes women. Like, and if the women who have this ability are not saying that, then like,
That is
where are
strange.
we? You know what I mean?
Right, right, right.
Yeah. So you have like the ability to collect this data or ask those who you're working with to collect this data. I'd say also, promotion, retention, um, that kind of, is super important. Who's hired, promoted, and retained. Basically looking at, yeah, like bottlenecks, like conversion rates, between stages rather than just like headline representation. That's what I would encourage people to look at.
I think that's a really like evocative, like the top of the bottleneck, and then what you describe is like going down and seeing when people are dropping off, like what's happening. I'm
Yeah.
curious. Well, actually, we only have like 3 minutes
Yeah.
left, so I'm not going to ask anything else. Um, but thank you so much, Megan, for this presentation. It's recorded. We'll share it with our networks and make it available on LinkedIn as well. Um, Anything else? Any sort of final comments you'd like to make?
I don't think so. I think I'd just say like, keep up the good work. Um, and keep these conversations going because um it is it can be a tough moment to be having these conversations. And yet like it's our own sort of form of resistance to keep having them. So yeah, thank you for that.
That's a great point. That's a great point. Well, again, thank you, Megan. And everyone who's joined, thank you for taking your time out of the day to join this conversation and provide your comments in the chat as well. With that, I guess I'll wrap up the webinar, and I hope everyone has a great rest of your day.
Thanks, you too.
Bye.